flag. My name is Chip Manekin. I'm director of the Meyerhoff Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Maryland. Go Terps. Any of you people have, good. Oh, great. Well, we are celebrating this year 40 years of Jewish studies at the University of Maryland since the establishment of the Kaplan Chair, Lewis Kaplan Chair in 1974. And we're going to have a big celebration in the fall, God willing. So all of you, if you were Terps, if you are Terps, if you have relatives who are Terps, I hope you will consider finding out a little more about our program. We have a Jewish Studies website, so you can Google Jewish Studies University of Maryland, and there you have it. You'll see. And now I'm going to close the door. Come in, come in. I'm going to start, and good. All right. So we have 30 minutes. I'm going to do this 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and 10 minutes, okay? 10 minutes is going to be just a little background on who Maimonides was. 10 minutes, we're going to go over some questions which I prepared, and I'll pretend that I'm Maimonides. Haha, that's interesting. And then if you have any other questions on Maimonides, just ask, and I'll do my best to answer them. Now, needless to say, this is a completely worthless endeavor, because Maimonides lived in the 12th century, doesn't live today. All right, but having said that, I'll do my best to give you a neo-Maimonidean response. So, there we go, 10 minutes. Moses Maimonides, some of you know about him, others don't, so who was he? He is great medieval Jewish rabbi and philosopher, born in 1138, dies in 1204. He's born in 1138 in Cordoba, Spain. Some of you have visited it. I haven't visited. There's a little Maimonides statue, etc. Very nice. I hope it's good for Jewish tourism. I haven't been there yet, but he's born in a very high point of Jewish civilization in Spain. And the first 10 years of his life, he lives the charmed life of someone who comes from the highest intellectual stratum of Cordoban Jewish society. His father was a prominent Dayan judge. His grandfather had been a prominent Dayan judge. He was the creme de la creme of, his family was the creme de la creme of Cordoban society. However, when he's 10 years old, the southern Spain, Al-Andalus, is conquered by, come in.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's locked?
It was locked.
Okay. Well, Cordoba is conquered when he's 10 years old by fanatical Muslim tribes, Muslim fundamentalist tribes from northern Spain. Berber tribes, these are the Almohads, and they give the Jews and Christians the choice. Become Muslim or leave. And when you leave your property behind, but get out. So he has to move around Spain, southern Spain, for a few years with his family. And during his formative years, they become basically exiles. They go for a period to Fez, Morocco. And there is a later period in their life while they're still wandering where they make a pilgrimage to the land of Israel, which he describes later, until finally, when he's about 30 years old, he ends up in the place where he's going to spend the rest of his life, and that's Old Cairo, Fustat in Egypt. Okay? You're going to, here, I'll tell you what, until I need this, you can have it. This is a good test. So we're in the first period of his life, all right? So he spends a time wandering, and at the same time, he is being educated in the typical education of somebody of his stature, in his class, in his time, which means a thorough rabbinical education, Talmud, post-Talmudic rabbinic stuff, education in science, what we call philosophy, science, astronomy, etc., logic, and also an education in medicine, probably because he figures that one day he may have to practice a little medicine. Well, this is actually what he will end up doing. But for the moment, in his first period, when he's about 30 years old, he finishes his first major work. Sorry if you can't see it. It's the commentary on the Mishnah. The Mishnah, some of you may know, is the first part of the Talmud. It's a code of rabbinic Jewish law which was written or edited around the 3rd century, 200 CE, by Rabbi Judah the Prince, up until the time of Maimonides. So that's where 900 years later, there had not been a commentary written specifically on the Mishnah, right? He writes a commentary. He writes it in a very beautiful Judeo-Arabic, because that's what everybody spoke in his circle, Arabic, and certainly it's Judeo-Arabic because it was written in Hebrew characters. He writes a commentary, and one of the interesting things about this commentary, by the way, he incorporates within his commentary in the Mishnah later legal conclusions, the Talmud, etc. One of the interesting things about this commentary is he has digressions at certain parts where he introduces material by having digressions into ethics and philosophy and history. Those are very interesting. One of those digressions is very well known. It's in his introduction to the commentary on the chapter of the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, which is called Chelek, all Jews, all Israel as a portion of the world to come. This is where he gives us 13 principles of faith. Some of you may be familiar because we sing it, Adon Olam, Yigdal. These are poetic, later liturgical formulations of the 13 principles of faith. We see from his earliest work, the commentary in the Mishnah, that what he calls the fundamentals of Torah are very, very important. He's a fundamentalist. He really believes that in addition to the Jewish law and what you're supposed to do, there's certain things that you're supposed to believe, you meaning Jews are supposed to believe, and he goes out of his way to explain what they are in that work. Now, from this period, 1167, around 1168, for the next 10 years, he works day and night on what is going to be his rabbinical masterpiece. That's his Code of Jewish Law, which he calls Mishnah Torah, the repetition of the law, which is a very bold title, because basically he claims in the introduction that once you have the Torah of Moses and my book, the Mishnah Torah, it will encompass all of Jewish law from the time of Moses, our prophet, to me. So that would include, of course, the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and everything else. He is going to give a halakhic digest, and that's what he does in 14 books. Okay, it's noted for it's a work which had never, the likes of which had never been seen before or since. There are other codes of Jewish law, but nothing of this nature. Why? In terms of scope, not only did Maimonides use practical Jewish law to tell us what practical Jewish law is, but a lot of laws which weren't relevant in his time, laws concerning the sacrifices, laws concerning the temple, laws concerning ritual purities, laws concerning kings and wars. It's not as if there was a Jewish king in the land of Israel at that time who had a state and he was waging war. So he nonetheless says, I'm going to give a complete overview, conspectus of Jewish law. He does that in 1177, 1178 he finishes. In 1177, a tremendous tragedy befalls him. And that's his brother. His brother dies on a merchant trip, a voyage to the Indian Ocean. Now you have to understand, Maimonides and his brother were he was the silent partner of a import-export venture, and he really was supported in his learning by his brother. Okay. So his brother was the merchant, he was the Talmud Chacham, he was the scholar, and he says 10 years he worked day and night on the Code of Jewish Law. 1177, his brother dies. For a year afterwards, he says, he's unable to do anything else. He's completely depressed. Now, of course, not only does he have to support his own family, because he refused to take any support from the community for his rabbinic work, because he says rabbis aren't allowed to take money for Torah. This, by the way, was one of the first things that was disputed by other rabbis. And this did not make the code of law, other subsequent code of laws. He says, the community can't pay for me for my teaching Torah. So as a result, he has to go to work now. Not only does he have to take care of his own family, but he has to take care of the widow's family, because his brother is dead. So this is where he really spends a lot of time becoming a doctor and taking students. One of the students he takes to study science and philosophy is a young man named Joseph ben Judah ibn Shimon, who comes to visit him around 1180. And from 1180 to 1185, they study science in an effort to try to understand the harmony of religion and science. How we can fit Torah, on the one hand, with scientific knowledge, as he understood scientific knowledge at that time. Okay, that yields in 1190 a great work, The Guide to the Perplexed, where he basically explains the Torah in such a way as to fit, for the most part, with one or two important exceptions, with Aristotelian science, which was the science at the time. Okay, from 1185 actually to the end of his life, he not only becomes famous as a physician among the Jews, but he's called in 1185 to the court of the Sultan in Cairo. Now you have to understand that the Sultan at the time when he was called is Saladin, who was off in the Holy Land fighting Richard the Lionhearted. You know, when I teach this to my students, I say, Maimonides was the doctor for the minister of the region of Saladin. Saladin fought against Richard the Lionhearted. Richard the Lionhearted brother was King Prince John. And Prince John, we know, got into all that trouble with Robin Hood, who was in love with Maid Marian. So there are like 5 degrees of separation between Maimonides and Maid Marian. Do come in. Do come in. This is not true. That's a little. I'm sorry I ran out of handouts.
Here's one.
Fine. How much is it? It's limited time.
Okay, thank you.
34 seconds in the first 10 minutes. Good. So the last part of his life, Maimonides is a big macher. He's one of the great physicians to the court of the Sultan. And he spends all of his time when he's writing medical writings. He does for the medical profession what he had done for the rabbinical profession. Just as he had written the Code of Jewish Law, the Mishnah Torah, which brought everything together in a convenient digest, he writes a series of books. Some are specific treatises. Treatise on asthma, for example, on impotence. He wanted one of his patrons wanted. There we go. 10 minutes is up. He dies in 1204. That's it. 10 minutes on Maimonides. Now, the next 10 minutes, what I thought I would do for you, before I answer your questions, is to look at some of the questions that I have written out as possible things. I'll pretend I'm Maimonides, where I would tell you what I think the sort of way he would answer. Okay, so one moment, please. There we go. Maybe I could just can you just borrow one of these?
We have some here.
Do you have an extra? Oh, even better. Okay. So I'm going to call on people to read. Number 1, any volunteers? Question number 1, 10 simple questions for Maimonides. Come on, how many opportunities do you have to ask Maimonides a question? Yeah.
Is Judaism just a way of life, or must a Jew believe something specific?
Okay, so Maimonides would say it's both. Yes, Judaism is a way of life. Halakha means literally a way of going. So there's certain things you have to do. But he was very insistent on the fact that Jews have to believe certain things. This was controversial. Not just the things that he says Jews have to believe, but the whole question as to whether belief is really fundamental to Judaism or not. Many of you grew up, or many of us grew up with the idea that this is the difference between Judaism and Christianity. Christianity has things that you believe, Judaism has things that you do. But when you get older, you know that Christianity has things that you do and believe, and Judaism has things that you believe. So he actually thought it was very, very important to stress that there are certain things which Jews have to believe, because he felt that these were absolute truths. And when Jews didn't believe it, he would get rather upset. Okay, I'll give you an example. Well, belief in God is an example. But even a more controversial example for the 12th century, the belief that God doesn't have a body. I would say that that's one of the few things where Maimonides said something which was actually accepted later on by the Jewish people. The fact that God doesn't have a body. Because in his period, although there were people who obviously didn't believe God had a body that you and I had, but there are all sorts of interpretations that God has. All of space is God's body, or there are midrashim that said that God has certain measurements to the body. So even though people would say it's a different kind of body from ours, nonetheless it was a body. Maimonides felt on scientific, we would call scientific things, that a God can only be pure intellect, pure form, and not have a body. Whether this is true or not, I'm not interested. But what is interesting is he required Jews to believe that. And he says Jews have to be taught, even at a young age, even though it seems to go against the literal meaning of Scripture, Jews have to understand that God can't have a body. So that was one of several things. Messiah, etc., 13 principles of faith. We're not going to sing Adon Olam here. Second question. Anybody want to read question 2? We'll go through this and have your questions here.
Can we prove there is a God, or is it a matter of faith?
Let's vote. Is it possible to prove, I did this in my classes, we'll decide by vote. Can God's existence be proved or demonstrated scientifically? Come on, don't be embarrassed. No, yes, maybe, I don't know. Who am I? What's going on?
No.
Oh, no. All right, no. My students say no. Good, very good, very good. All right, is it a matter of faith? Yes. Okay, all right. Now, I put my Mr. Maimonides hat on, I say, no, that's not true. It is a Maimonides. Maimonides says you can prove that not only can you prove that God exists, but it's an easy proof. It's something which is almost self-evident. Now, it's hard for us to buy that because we live after the 18th century. But up through the first 17th centuries of this common era, there was the assumption that not only does God exist, but it's scientifically demonstrated that God exists. Okay. So from the standpoint of a 12th century person, he gives demonstrations, he gives proofs. It's not a big deal for him. But for those people who can't follow the science, in other words, those people who really can't understand the Aristotle behind the science, he would say, for you guys can accept it on the basis of traditional authority. The Torah was given at Sinai, it was witnessed before a lot of people, it was passed on, we experienced miracles, etc. And so that's a good enough proof for you. So he distinguished between those who are able to scientifically demonstrate the existence of God as opposed to those people who accept it on faith. The people who can scientifically demonstrate it are on a higher level, because once you can see it through your own reason, and it's not just based on authority, the authority of reason is going to be the highest authority. Now, because I don't know, maybe something I read in the New York Times or the Baltimore Sun, chances are it's correct, but you don't know. But 2 + 2 = 4, that I have no problem with. So he actually believed, we don't, but he believed that demonstrating God's existence was as simple and as self-evident as 2 + 2 = 4. Well, almost. Another question, because I want to save room for your questions.
Can I study anything I like, or are there important things for me to study?
Yeah, so can I study anything I want? Or are there or is there a hierarchy? What do you think he would say?
Hierarchy.
There is a hierarchy. The truth is that he has a single-minded view about what people should study. Now, he realizes that some people, you have to make a living. We're going to talk about that soon, how you figure that in. But basically, he gives a curriculum. That curriculum is going to include Jewish subjects, but also what we would call today secular subjects. Science, philosophy, astronomy, biology, all this is necessary. I can tell you what he would completely disapproved of. Spending the morning, noon, and night studying Talmud. That, he says, is a waste of time. Talmud. That, if you're for its own sake. That, he says, and these are his words, waste of time. However, he does think students should master Talmud as they're growing up. It's very important for them. They won't be able to understand Jewish law without doing it, but they can't spend their time on commentaries except for his own book. Except my book and Talmud, and maybe one of the earlier authorities like Isaac Alfazi, who was a great authority. He says to his prize student, he says, you read my book with Isaac Alfazi's book, and when you see their disagreements, go back to the Talmud, and you'll see that I've generally ruled according to the Talmud. Right? Everything else is, he says, a waste of time. So yes, science is very important because everything is for one goal according to Maimonides. And that goal is what he calls knowing God, knowing God's ways, understanding nature, which is God's ways in the world, understanding the laws of nature. So he's big on science, he's big on studying, he's big on trying, and also he's big on other things. Like, for example, he's big on good diet. He's a doctor, right? So in his code of Jewish law, he has a section where he talks about what foods you should eat, when you should eat them, and in what combinations you should eat them, when you should exercise. If you have if you have a good exercise and a bad diet, he says you'll be better off than if you have a good diet and no exercise. This is his view, okay? But you should have both. And this he puts in not just his medical writings, but in his code of Jewish law. Okay. Next, well, I should skip the next one.
Yeah.
All right. Are women commanded to learn Torah the way men are?
No.
The answer is no. But it's actually a little more complicated. Because, yes, women are exempt from the mitzvah of studying Talmud, according to, not only Torah. And I like to point out to my friends down Park Heights Avenue, not only are they exempt from studying Talmud, but according to Torah, they shouldn't be studying written Torah either, right? Listen, he lives in the 12th century. He's in a Muslim society. He's a sexist. What do you want? I mean, this is nothing I can do about it. There are a lot worse things, and even in the 12th century in Europe, he has a statement. He says, a husband, in order to instruct his wife, can hit her with a whip. And right in real time, in the southern France, Abraham Ben David of Posquier says, where does he get this from? There is not, well, the answer is he probably got it from Muslim society, but there's nothing like this that he can get it from. So yes, in general, the man is not exactly. On the other hand, there is another hand. The three people, according to Maimonides, who achieved the highest level that humans could achieve were Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. So, that family. So as my friend Manekin Keller says, 1 out of 3, 33% for the 12th century, that's not so bad. Also, he says women are actually are obligated to understand the foundations. In order to understand the foundations of Torah, you have to know science, and he thinks they're able to do that. So there are many ways you can play if you want to play, but on the whole, he's a sexist. That's it. Have to stop. All right. Let me just see if there's one more question, and I'll open it up for you guys.
What do you think about?
Just a minute. Work. I want to balance my commitment between work, family, and other things. Maimonides was the greatest rabbi of his time, and he knew it. He was completely aware that he was the greatest rabbi of his time. What does he do for the last 10 years of his life? He writes. He's writing medical writings. He's spending all of his time either healing people in the Sultan's palace, or when he comes back, he has this beautiful letter which he describes his day. It's very famous. He comes back, he has barely no time. There's a whole line out waiting for him to heal the Jews in his Jewish neighborhood, for him to heal them. It's like his office hours are like 1 in the afternoon on. He has no time for anything until except for Shabbat. And on Shabbat, everybody's standing up in line to asking him questions of Jewish law. So he has literally no time to study science, he says, except for maybe a half an hour before I fall asleep. So this is a man who was able to, if he wanted to, spend perhaps more time in the study of Talmud, but he decides to devote his life to, and it's a real problem for him. How does one make time for what you're supposed to do, which is to commune with God and also be a communal leader? And I'll just raise the question. There are answers, but it's really the question that people ask all the time about his life. How was he able to do that as much as he did? One answer is that when he does his Mishnah Torah, he basically, that's it for him in Talmud. He answers questions concerning it, he revises it, but he turns to other things. So it's a tough question, but he would say the overarching goal should be a life of worship of God, but we get to that in different ways. Okay, I have 6 minutes left? Questions from the floor? Yeah.
Yes,
sorry.
it's Lag BaOmer Maimonides, Shimon Border Okai. What is your opinion of today's significance and the Bar Bar Kokhba revolt?
Shimon Bar Yochai was a great rabbi. Lag BaOmer is a tantamount to idolatry. It's based, no, the celebration, which is the bonfires and stuff, that's what I'm thinking about in Israel. That aspect of it has to do with the burning of the woods. It all has to do with Kabbalah, and he was not a Kabbalist.
He's a rationalist.
He's a rationalist. He's very much a rationalist. The Bar Kokhba revolt he actually talks about, and he talks about the fact that Rabbi Akiva was a great rabbi who nonetheless thought Bar Kokhba was the Messiah, and he brings that as an example of how the Messiah doesn't have to do miraculous things in order to be accepted as the Messiah. All he has to do is succeed, and succeed in defeating the Gentiles, bringing the Jews back to the land of Israel, etc., and establishing a messianic time when there will be no wars. And what's the purpose of the messianic time for Maimonides? Answer: people will be free to study Torah and to study, to become closer to God. By the way, when I say study Torah, it's meant in the broadest sense. That would be anything a university does would be considered study of Torah. Anything that has to do with science, with understanding the world, that is part of Torah. And actually, when he talks about dividing your time, how do you divide your curriculum, he actually says that specifically. Physics and metaphysics is part of what he calls Talmud. And you're supposed to be spending more time doing that. Yeah.
How would excuse me, Maimonides define a Jew? What makes a person a Jew?
Good question. So there's a halakhic definition which he accepts. A halakhic definition, it comes from the Mishnah, is someone either born of a Jewish mother or converts to Judaism. All right. However, having said that, he places a great premium on what I call beliefs.
I was going to say, does behavior count at all?
Behavior counts, but in some ways, beliefs are more important for him. He has a quite shocking statement in the end of the 13 principles, where he says, any Jew who accepts these 13 principles and believes in the 13 principles of faith, is considered to be one of the Jewish people and will have a portion in the world to come. Even though he does all the sins in the world, he's a sinner and he'll be punished for that, but he's still part of the Jewish people. However, if there's any one of the people, people who claim to be Jews, who deny one of these 13 principles of faith, this person is a heretic. We are commanded to hate him, to seek his destruction. This is what he writes, but he didn't practice what he preached. And I can prove that. Because one of the categories of heretics he would say, he claims, are the Karaites. The Karaites were Jews who accepted the authority of the written Torah, but not the authority of the rabbis, the oral Torah. And there were many, many Karaites living in Egypt when Maimonides was there. So according to Maimonides, he should have been out persecuting like Torquemada, the Karaites. They shouldn't have had any standing. And yet, he's asked specifically in a question, how are we supposed to relate to the Karaites? And he goes, what a question. They're Jews. He says, if in the case of idolaters, we're supposed to, for the sake of peace, for the ways of peace, we are supposed to take care of their sick, bury their dead, and give charity to idolaters, which he thinks is a horrible, horrible sin for being barbarians. He says, obviously in the case of Karaites, that we're supposed to take care of them. And that, he says, because they're not responsible for their beliefs, which are wrong. They're not responsible because he uses this phrase, they're like captive children. They have to be excused because they were brought up in these ways which are not correct. It's not pluralism. It's not our saying, what I say is my view and what he says is what they say is their view. He thinks their view is wrong, but he sort of excuses them because he says they were brought up in this way. This, by the way, is used nowadays in Orthodox circles. It's been used very, very often in order to excuse, as it were, non-Orthodox Jews. You can't blame them because they're not responsible because they were brought up non-Orthodox, etc. I'm just telling you, I'm not endorsing anything. Yes, we have time for 2 more questions.
Rabbi,
I should really ask over here, too.
as a rabbi and a doctor, can you address...
I'm not a rabbi.
Oh,
Some of my best friends are rabbis. Oh, as Maimonides.
yes. Thank you.
Good point.
Yeah, thank you.
Got me nervous for a
As
while.
rabbi and a doctor, as Maimonides,
Yeah.
can you talk about the role of spirituality in health and healing?
Yes, I would, that's a very good question, and I have an answer for that. I believe that there's a strong influence of the mind over the body, as it were. That in order to have a healthy body, one needs to have a physician of the soul. And through achieving a well-balanced and integrated personality, and I have actually instructions for how to do that. But in order to, if one achieves that, that will help your physical health and vital person. There's a there's a strong bond, a connection. Maimonides was not a dualist. He didn't believe that there was a soul which was a separate substance from the body. He basically thought that the soul was the functioning of the body, and that a part of that soul was the mind, the intellect, etc. So as a result, there's this really strong body-soul connection. And therefore, yes, it's very important to not just have the right physical fitness regime and diet, but also to have that as part of you call it spiritual, he could also call it spiritual. But I must say, his notion of spiritualism is much, of course, closer to intellectualism. Because that's really, he is a rationalist and he's really gung-ho about that. But in principle, yes. By the way, the man who says he's a rationalist and spend all your time studying science, he says, take a break. Take walks in the park. Not on Sunday afternoons. Take walks in the park. Listen to music. Find food. Very important in order to refresh yourself. Why? So you can study better. One more question. Do you have a question? You want to ask a question?
Later in life, he didn't understand why he didn't get chosen for prophecy. How did he get over that, or did he?
Oh, this is an old question as to whether he thought that he was going to a prophet or not. My interpretation of Maimonides is that he did not think that he was a prophet, and so he really didn't have to worry about getting over it because he didn't expect he would be. I think he says that there cannot be prophecy when Jews are in the exile because in order to be a prophet, you have to be happy. And Jews who are in the exile cannot entirely be happy. And since the destruction of the temple, and even beforehand, there hadn't been prophecy for that reason. But who knows? Maybe prophecy will come back. That was a good question. That's it. Very good. On your way out, there are two books I can recommend. This is an easier read. Maimonides by Moshe Halbertal just came out this year. Maimonides is Life and Thought. It's not an easy read, but it's a good read. This is a harder read, Moses Maimonides by Herbert Davidson. Maimonides, Halbertal, Davidson, all you have to remember. Okay, thank you very much. Go to your next class. Thanks for the vote. Thank you.